Hello, everyone. I hope that you and your families are safe and well, especially during these challenging times. Welcome to the last ICVG webinar for 2021, titled Governance and Management Control Implications of the New Emphasis on Corporate Social Responsibility. So before I introduce our webinar speaker and the moderator, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which our 4 Australian campuses stand, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Our webinar speaker for today is Professor Ken Merchant, the Emeritus Deloitte and Touche Chair in Accountancy and Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. Professor Merchant is an expert in management accounting, management control systems, and corporate governance. He has published in elite journals and has received numerous awards, including 5 notable contributions to research awards from the American Accounting Association, 2 for lifetime contributions to the field, and a whole range of other accolades that I think I don't have time to actually list. He has also received an honorary doctorate from the Turku School of Economics in Finland in 2010. Professor Merchant served as the Dean of the Leventhal School of Accounting from 1994 to 2001. And before joining the University of Southern California, he has taught at the Harvard Business School and UC Berkeley. Our webinar moderator for today is Associate Professor Ralph Huber from the Department of Accounting at Monash University. Ralph has a broad range of interests in research spanning management accounting, accounting education, intellectual disability, and quality of life. Ralph's research has been published in a range of top-tier accounting, education, and psychology journals. And prior to joining Monash University, Ralph was employed at the University of Auckland and the University of Western Australia. Ralph has also been actively involved with a variety of academic and professional associations, having previously held various positions of responsibility across numerous associations, including being Vice President of the New Zealand branch of CPA Australia. I now invite Ken to give his talk, which will last around half an hour or so, followed by a 20-minute Q&A, which will be moderated by Ralph. So please post any question or comment you have in the Q&A section, and Ralph will then moderate that and ask Ken to be there. So thank you for attending the webinar, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed. All yours, Ken.
Very good. Thanks, Christo. And good morning to everybody. I'm honored to be part of this program. I know Monash University, respect it and its faculty, and I'm very pleased to be able to present under the Monash banner. Let me share my screen and I'll get going here. All right, so this is a broad topic, both focusing on governance and management control. So it's a management emphasis and this new topic of corporate social responsibility. The terminology in this area can be confusing, so I thought I would just start with a brief introduction of terminology. One term you hear a lot is this term called sustainability, which has to do with meeting the needs of the present without destroying the future. And that's a term that's very popular, but it's narrower than corporate social responsibility, as I'll explain. Back in the 80s, the accountants got into this area and developed measures on what they called the triple bottom line, which had to do with reported as profit, people, and planet. While there was a lot of research done in how to report results, performance in each of those areas, it sort of never picked up because the business world wasn't ready for it. You still see that term around a little bit, but it's not a popular term now. Another popular term is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And this is the term that investors tend to has to do with measuring non-financial factors about a company that can affect valuations of the company, or it can also be useful for regulators and other stakeholders. But the primary purpose use of it is in by investors wanting to assess companies' performance in the ESG area for making investment decisions. And then finally, we get to corporate social responsibility, which is the term I'm going to use because it's so broad. It includes all of the other things. It's not a very well-defined term. One paper that here I've cited noted, but most of the dimensions in these definitions have to do with economic, stakeholder, environmental, and social performance. But it goes well beyond the profit bottom line. Okay, so keep those terms in mind, but I'm going to use the corporate social responsibility term through most of this. There are some others around corporate social performance, corporate citizenship, and so on. All right, so the world has changed. Back when I was an MBA student, I hate to say how many years ago, we were taught in our courses that the responsibility of business was to generate maximum profits, and if there were any social goals to be fulfilled, the government had the primary role in doing that. And Milton Friedman got famous for this and other things and won a Nobel Prize. Now we've thrown out his thinking, and there have been a number of initiatives that have told us that the whole goal of the corporation has changed. And so here's a quote from the Business Roundtable in a document called Statement of the Purpose of the Corporation. Business Roundtable is a membership organization of the top CEOs in the US. So it says, each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. So it's not profit anymore. There are other indications that the world has changed too. The large investment firm BlackRock, the largest in the world, now requires its fund managers to consider ESG performance in making their investment decisions. It's affected the director world too. In 2019, directors at ExxonMobil were facing a withhold campaign because two large institutional shareholders alleged the company had failed to be sufficiently responsive to climate change. So the point I'm trying to make is profits is not the sole be all of the corporation anymore. It's broader, and I'm going to call it corporate social responsibility. But have directors noticed? There was a survey done late 2019, and 56% of US corporate directors said that institutional investors devote too much attention to environmental and sustainability issues. So I'm not sure corporate directors have gotten the message as completely as they should. And I guess that's one of the purposes of a program like this at Monash, to talk about corporate governance and how it needs to be broadened. So what is corporate social responsibility? Here's three possible definitions. It has to do with voluntary initiatives toward the various stakeholders. It surpasses compliance, so there's a sacrifice involved. It's not just maximizing profits for shareholders, but it's going over and beyond for some public good and beyond what's required by law. And then there's a simple definition: discretionary citizenship. So volunteering to do good for society. Whatever the definition you want to use, we can apply it to many different domains. There are environmental domains and so product domains, supply chain domains, philanthropy, community relations, community service, and so on. So it's a very broad term, but it's going beyond profits to do something good for other stakeholders. So the current situation, most corporate social responsibility activity and reporting is voluntary. It's not legally required. Although in the EU, there's a recent directive that requires companies with more than 500 employees, which is a lot of them, to publish regular reports on the social and environmental impacts of their activities. When you have to report something, then you feel some obligation to do something because you have something to report. The EU is not very specific about what they require, so companies are doing all kinds of different things. But there's less acceptance of what has come to be known as greenwashing. A typical greenwashing statement is we commit to reduce our carbon footprint, but there's no goals and there's no timetable and so on. So this is still a discretionary activity. And we do know that the demand for more information in the ESG or corporate social responsibility area is greater than supply. So there's a survey done in 2018. Only 30% of investors were happy with the ESG information they were getting. So it's a growing area, not much standardization of the reporting requirements or activities for that matter. What I want to focus on are the manager's corporate social responsibility issues, and I think there are two. The first one is, how do you make good corporate social responsibility related decisions? Should you consider it at all? If so, how much do you invest? And if you do invest, where do you allocate the investments? The second important part of this for management purposes is I would call management control or execution. Once you've decided to do something in this CSR area, how do you make sure that the programs get implemented as desired? And that turns out to be very difficult in some areas because you can't measure performance very effectively. So we'll talk through that. So to bring this so it's not just a totally abstract discussion, I wanted to illustrate some of the points with talking about the CSR program at Microsoft Corporation. I'm sure all of you know Microsoft. They've got an award-winning CSR program. The company's mission is very broad, to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. Doesn't get much broader than that. The CSR program at Microsoft was clearly a top-down initiative by Satya Nadella, the CEO. Here's a quote from his book, which is called Hit Refresh. He said, "We, Microsoft, have practically a moral obligation to continue to innovate, to build technology to solve big problems, to be a force for good in the world, as well as a tool for economic growth. I don't say this for purposes of so-called corporate social responsibility, which is important, but can also serve as little more than good PR. I say it because a better world is better for business. It's important to be dedicated to creating great products, serving customers, and earning profits for investors, but it's not sufficient. We also need to think about the impact of our actions on the world and its citizens long into the future." So he recognizes or believes that Microsoft has a purpose beyond just earning profits. And he's created this CSR initiative and passed it on down through the organization. In Microsoft, there are three main areas of CSR emphasis. One they call empowering people. So it's providing tools for people to do more, protecting their privacy and data security and so on, human rights, and doing well for the employees. Second area is strengthening communities, which has to do with helping nonprofits fulfill their functions, getting involved in local communities, participating in public policy and decisions and so on. And then finally, the sustainability initiative, try to minimize the carbon footprint, use of energy, minimize waste, and so on. So this is the three areas they picked out to emphasize. And what top management does is, at Microsoft, this is all top-down driven. They engage with stakeholders and other experts and discuss what initiatives that Microsoft ought to focus on. These are their top issues for 2019. Pretty broad terms, but using technology is critical for them. Accessibility of their products to disabled people, for example. Climate change, privacy, and security. There's nothing particularly surprising here, but they have listed out their initiatives. So let's talk about making CSR-related decisions. Some CSR activities clearly benefit the corporation in the short run. These are called win-win activities, doing well by doing good, or synergistic value creation. Oops. Cutting costs, obviously. Exploiting a competitive advantage, building a product that does good for people, also generates profits for the company, Microsoft. Enhance the reputation. If a company has a good reputation in the CSR area, Suppliers like doing business with them, employees like working for them, customers like buying their products. And this good reputation can be seen like an insurance buffer against adverse political events. So it kind of buffers you from bad news that come down the road. So if ExxonMobil, for example, had a good reputation in the CSR area, they might not have taken as big a hit when their oil tanker spilled oil all over the beaches, and so people feel good about corporations that do good in the CSR area. So these are the win-win activities. So let's talk about some of the initiatives in Microsoft. Which of these initiatives create value in the short run? Well, if you cut water waste, you save costs, so that's a win-win. They gave away laptop computers in sub-Saharan Africa. Is that a good thing? Well, it cost them the computers, but it gave them a foothold in this market. And when the sub-Saharan African people had money to buy computers, the first computer they'll think of is Microsoft. And so they'll be selling a lot of Microsoft Surfaces in Africa. So that gives them a foothold into the market. Responsible sourcing. They don't buy from suppliers, for example, that employ child labor. This may not create value for Microsoft in the short run because the factories that employ child labor tend to have lower costs. So this is an example of one that may not be a win-win activity, but they do it anyway. They encourage the use of energy derived from renewable energy sources. Well, this may be more expensive in the short run also. Water power is pretty cheap, but we've run out of extra water power. So other sources of energy like wind and solar tend to be more expensive than the other sources. So this may not be a win-win in the short run. They developed a version of Word usable by blind individuals. It seems like an extra cost to have to develop a whole new set of protocols for Word so that people who can't see the screen can use it. But it turns out there are a lot of blind people in the world. And so this created a new market for them, and it turned out to be a profitable market of a version of Word for blind individuals. There are enough blind individuals that made it profitable. So some of these create value for Microsoft in the short run, others don't. They also have a new program at Microsoft of hiring autistic individuals, adding to their employee base people with autism. They started this program because they thought it was the right thing to do, but they found that there are a lot of very talented autistic individuals. So not only is it the right thing to do, it's brought a lot of talent, unique talent into the organization, and they think in the long term, or even in the short term, this program has helped Microsoft. But let's talk about the other activities, the CSR activities that can have an adverse effect on the company's profits and stock price, at least in the short run. These are transferring firm resources to non-shareholder stakeholders. In the US, there's a famous court case that says that directors have to make decisions that are in the interest of the stakeholders. That's going to hit the court again somewhere because a lot of companies are doing things that are not shareholder wealth maximizing that seem to be in violation of this previous court case. And sometime that's going to hit the court again. So here's some examples of short-term adverse effects. I've just talked about the renewable energy sources and the responsible sources. Making contributions to charities has no direct benefit on the corporation. It takes corporate resources and hands it to arts organizations, for example. In the traditional corporate finance world, which we've all studied, these investments cause an agency problem. They alienate investors. There are a few investors who look for corporations who don't make these types of investments, and they run the risk of causing the company to lose focus on the shareholders. And some of the economists, the financial economists, are having trouble struggling getting to the new world. They still believe in this old corporate finance tradition of short-term profits maximization. but the world is changing, as I said. So let's talk about these two dimensions of performance. I've lumped all the corporate social performance into one dimension, the x-axis, and put financial performance on the y-axis. So if you're improving, making an investment that does both improve financial performance and CSR performance, that's your win-win category. The opposite, where you make bad investments that harm both areas of performance, that's a lose-lose. And then there are these two other boxes where you gain in one and lose in the other. Which investments should you make? Well, the win-win, sometimes called bright green investments, you should make those. The lose-lose, you shouldn't make those. The interesting areas for us to talk about are these trade-offs where you're trading off financial performance for CSR performance. So in the area where you're making decisions that improve financial performance but harming CSR performance, companies have been making those investments for years. So they improve profits but pollute the environment, or cause more carbon use that contributes to climate change. Companies have been using in this area. They're getting some social pressure not to make these types of investments anymore. The ones that are more interesting now are the ones where financial performance is harmed, but CSR performance is helped. What I want to discuss is whether companies should make these investments. So these are costing in the financial performance dimension, but they somehow improve CSR performance. I think how you think about these investments has to do with how you think about CSR in general. Do you consider environmental and social objectives an opportunity to do well by doing good? Do you think of them as, they came together, all right. Necessary for good risk management, because you can factor these things into your risk management matrix, because they create social pressure. They can cause insurance to go up and so on. And then some companies look at these as a corporate responsibility, duty, or moral obligation. And that's where Satya Nadella is with Microsoft. He believes that CSR is the company's responsibility. So here's my tentative theory for how you make and prioritize various CSR investments. This is subject to refinements. It's obviously very terse, but being in companies and talking to the managers, how they make decisions, I think this is the way to look at the CSR investment area. Make all the win-win investments you can make, because you'll get positive reputation benefits from the CSR improvement, and you also improve profits. Of all the things you might do, pick areas that are of most direct relevance to your business. So Microsoft's interested in information technology, which leads them into data privacy and data security areas, obviously. Companies will respond to social pressure. So if you're getting social pressure for performance in a given area, if you're an oil company, you're probably getting pressure in the global warming area. It's probably wise to respond to that, because that's where you can most improve your reputation. And then it's easiest to implement these programs if you have a champion within the organization. So somebody down lower in the organization has to step up and say, I believe in this, I will help you manage it. And if you have all of these things in place, you're more likely to have success with your CSR investments. But I pulled out a couple of quotes from Microsoft, a manager at Microsoft I talked to, and Julie Zunker said, we don't start with an ROI analysis. We evaluate good social impact and commit to our programs. And it would be difficult for us, Microsoft, to put an example of too expensive in print. They're so large and with such resources that if it's the right thing to do, they can probably afford to do it. So yeah, this is a company that believes in doing good, even if it costs the company a fair bit of money. They don't worry too much about the financial analyses. These decisions might be a little bit different in smaller and private corporations. And I've been a director of 7 corporations, more in the mid to smaller range. And frankly, we didn't talk much about corporate social responsibility in the board meetings. We weren't facing the political pressure. We didn't have requirements, formal reporting requirements in the CSR area. And then one of the companies I was in had so much for short-term financial pressure, we weren't thinking about anything other than survival. So you may get different answers with companies that don't face the political pressure or are facing the financial pressure. So let's talk quickly about the other strategy, the execution strategy is the other major area that managers have to worry about. I think there are just a few generic execution strategies. You could call them tools or techniques. One is you give people a goal and you measure performance, provide incentives for improvement. You can make these individual incentives, you could make them group incentives, or you could do it business-wide incentive. A second execution strategy is your policies and procedures manual. Set up rules and regulations, or more generically, a code of conduct. You train people what behaviors you expect of them. You audit their behaviors and provide enforcement if necessary. And third is to sprinkle through the organization, I call them passionate CSR people with jawboning rights. So if you want to have your corporation come up with a version of wine for blind people, hire a blind person or a bunch of them and have them go meet with engineers and explain their need for the product. They're passionate about the product because they need it. And they, through the rights of going out and talking to the engineers, convincing engineers to develop this product. And then, of course, you need the support from top management, which feeds into the organization culture and tone at the top. If top management's not into this CSR area, not much is going to get done. So there's the generic execution strategies. Let's take some examples of CSR initiatives at Microsoft and see if they map over to these execution strategies that I just described. So one of the CSR initiatives at Microsoft is carbon neutrality. The easiest way to get carbon neutrality is give somebody a goal, measure performance and an incentive. In fact, that's true. That's what Microsoft does in all the areas where they can measure success very effectively. So water usage, renewable energy source, waste, and so on. Some of the incentives they have are individual incentives. More of them are group level incentives. And in the carbon neutrality area, they do something a little bit different. Since 2013, they've had a business carbon tax in the organization. And so if somebody in an organization takes a jet plane ride somewhere, they're charged extra for using burning some carbon and polluting the environment. So the next one is making Microsoft products usable, efficient, and delightful for disabled people, like the blind, the deaf, and so on. Well, here they did exactly what I said. They hired disabled people and told the engineers they had to listen to them. And these jawboning rights have created some very good new products for Microsoft. Responsible sourcing. They don't want to buy from factories overseas that employ child labor, don't have good safety regulations, so on. So they've got a very elaborate set of regulations that they use for their suppliers. They train their suppliers, they audit their suppliers, and if the suppliers don't comply, they no longer are suppliers for Microsoft. They may get warned once, but then they're cut off. So that's a very different form of control in this area of CSR. Data security and online safety are very hard to measure, but where they can measure it, they provide business incentives. So, they have business incentives for the corporations for responsible sourcing. The businesses who don't comply also get penalized. The data security and online safety are set out with some of its legal requirements, but Microsoft goes beyond the legal requirements to track data security and online safety. and there's a lot of training involved. So the point here is that there are multiple ways of getting things done, and the type of CSR initiatives depends on which execution strategy you choose. If you can measure performance, you probably lean to some kind of incentives. If you can't, then you have some other alternatives. And all of these initiatives actually rely on passionate employees with job owning rights. I spent a day with the corporate social responsibility people, the function at Microsoft, and these people really believe in what they're doing. They're passionate about what they do. We would call them on the liberal progressive side of the business world, but they've had an effect on the organization through their passion. They spread it through the organization. Are some execution strategies better than others? Well, I think it would be nice if all employees were passionate about CSR. That would be called an embedded CSR culture. But how do you think the average engineer at Microsoft feels about the company's CSR activities? Are they enthusiastic about them? Are they ambivalent or at least tolerant? Or are they negative? Well, when the CSR program was started, I would say most of them were negative. It disrupted the way they were thinking. Over time, some of them have tolerated the blind person sitting across from them in their office telling them they need to do things differently. And I guess a few of them are enthusiastic, but the bulk of the engineer crowd and Microsoft engineers drive the products. They're still in the ambivalent and tolerant phase of development. So here's my tentative theory on execution strategies. Again, we'll flesh this out over time with a lot of research. I think where they're usable, what I would call results controls, which is setting goals, measuring performance, and providing incentives, yield the best outcomes. It instantly creates a congruence between the organization and the individual. The organization can define the goals that it wants to fulfill, and the incentives create a congruence of goals with the individual's goals. So you get accountability. If you define the goals right, you get freedom of action. So there may be no one way to accomplish the result. Employees can do it to fit their own style. It can stimulate creativity because different people will come up with different ways of achieving the results they're designed. So these are very powerful forms of reward where you can implement them. But there are many CSR management challenges. A lot of companies, when they're giving out their PR about the CSR performance, they'll tell you how much they invested in CSR, and they're kind of vague on what that accomplished. There are many different output units of measure. It's not like we have profits that take financial measurements all down to one dimension. So we've got carbon usage and waste, and it's very hard to compare performance across the multiple output units of measure. There's a lot of noise in the measurements. If you want to measure water usage, for example, you may have to implement a brand new water usage system. You can't. Some water is used up. Some of it's just polluted. So you'd have to develop systems to measure these things. And most companies don't have good measurement tools, and there are inconsistent reporting methods. There are different definitions of materiality for different areas, for different corporations that are hard to compare. So the overall ratings that some people try to publicize, there are 3 publications in the US that publish overall CSR ratings. They are Newsweek, Forbes, and CSR Magazine Global. So they publish overall ratings of CSR performance. They don't tell you much about their methods, and when we do studies to look at whether the overall ratings are comparable, we find the correlation between these 3 ratings range from 0.13 to 0.52. They're measuring different things. So we don't really know what good CSR, overall CSR performance is, or there are different ways of defining it. In most of these areas, the measures are probably not audited, although 2/3 of the large US corporations now are employing auditors to audit some CSR measures, but not all of them, and some companies don't have auditors involved at all. And auditors are still developing their techniques on how to audit these things. So the last thing I want to talk about is how you keep these programs going. Satya Nadella is clearly a CSR zealot. He believes in it. He's told his managers that they need to believe in it, and he's fed it down through the organization. But what happens to Microsoft's CSR program when Satya Nadella is no longer the CEO? Microsoft has something they call the CSR maturity model. The first thing you do when you implement a CSR program is you enforce compliance. You tell people what they want, what you want, and then make sure they give you what you want. The second stage is self-management, where the people have goals embedded either in themselves or by the corporation, and they act to fulfill these goals. The most mature model is culture, where everybody in the organization believes in the CSR mission and acts accordingly. The one quote that I got when I was in Microsoft was, "Once we get there to culture, it will be hard to turn back." So if the culture is embedded in Microsoft at the time Satya Nadella turns the CEO role over to his successor, it's too late. The new CEO is going to have to run a CSR-oriented organization. So here are my final thoughts. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Probably went over a little bit. The world is changing, and the change is really profound. It's changing the goals of the corporation, what the corporations are supposed to be doing. It's not just profits and short-term financial returns anymore. Firms are being asked to report more about their performances. When you have to report about your CSR performance, you'll probably think about what you ought to do so that you have something good to report that will induce more CSR investment and different CSR investment. That's a rapidly evolving area because we haven't locked in on what the CSR reports should look like yet. But the interesting questions from my perspective as a management accountant, I'm interested in whether companies are making the right CSR decisions from the whole range of decisions they could make. And then once they've made these decisions, are they executing these difficult to management CSR programs effectively, or will they be wasting a lot of money? There's a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, and we need a partnership between academia and managers to jointly figure out what's best practice in this area. It's rapidly developing. So I'll leave it there for questions, comments. If anybody wants to email me, there's my email address, and I'll turn it back to Ralph.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. That was a great presentation. And just a reminder, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've already got a few. And an apology if I can't answer everyone's questions, but I'll try and summarize some themes. I suppose one relates to the issue of culture. I mean, culture has come through as very important from what you've said, but I think it's an area that maybe as researchers and in business that we have tended to neglect. So your thoughts on how we can sort of overcome that and how we can focus more on culture and getting that right?
Well, there's a long history of culture. We can learn from anthropologists and sociologists and how they study culture, but we can measure culture. Culture has to do with shared norms and values. And so we have measures of culture. There are lots of things that affect culture. Culture has lots of effects. So I don't see culture as particularly more difficult to study and understand than any other area related to management. The measures might be a little softer, I'll grant you that, but there's been enough research in the area now that we can measure aspects of culture, if not culture overall, and do empirical studies in the area of culture. And we can learn from our anthropological friends who spend their lifetimes studying culture. They study nothing more than culture. So.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe if I could ask you possibly to stop sharing your slides, then.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And a question that's popped up in the Q&A about the ABR statement. Would you see that as a lot more rhetoric rather than any real change, especially given that there seemed to be a disconnect between the fact that 56% of the US corporate directors said that they thought institutional investors paid too much attention to CSR?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, why do so many directors not perceive the movement to CSR or not want to believe in it? The average director is probably 65 years old. Their training and experience was in an earlier era. And they're slow to adapt to the new world. Is certainly part of it. There's a resistance to change. And the pressures on most corporations are very great in many areas. Competition is higher than it's ever been. We've just been through a recession and now a pandemic. So there are lots of things to talk about, and somehow CSR hasn't made it to the boardroom as much as it should have. But I think that's one of the purposes of a program like this, to talk about corporate governance and broaden the discussion in the boardrooms to include CSR. If it hasn't gotten to the boardroom yet, it's coming very soon, and directors need to get out in front of it.
So you see the ABR's comment as more than rhetoric?
Well, the statistic that I put up was a survey done by the Donnelly organization. So it's not a position statement by any organization. It's just a snapshot of a point in time. And I don't think any responsible organization would say that directors should systematically ignore CSR discussions in their boardroom.
Yep. Another question we've got relates to the balanced scorecard. So the balanced scorecard has been touted as an important strategy tool. So in your opinion, should we continue on with something like the balanced scorecard, or do we need to, within the firm, change to some sort of different type of scorecard, given the insights that you've presented?
Yeah, the balanced scorecard has proved to be very popular. But I don't think it's popular for the reasons that it was originally developed. It was originally developed as a performance measurement system, recognizing the fact that profits weren't telling the whole story of performance in an organization. What I think has happened in the balanced scorecard is that it has evolved into a strategy formulation process and framework. So you put people into a room and a process that helps them think about what's really important in the organization and who ought to be responsible for what and how you measure performance in all of these areas. Corporate social responsibility is not one of the dimensions of the original balanced scorecard. Some companies have added it as a fifth or sixth dimension. So you can adapt the balanced scorecard framework to talk about how corporate social responsibility fits into the initiatives in an organization. But the balanced scorecard fails in terms of as a performance measurement system because there are too many measurements. They're not weighted, and it causes a diffusion of focus unless you break the focus down to each individual level. So corporate social responsibility may be very important for some people and not for others. So what I'm saying is the balanced scorecard is a useful tool that can be applied into the corporate social responsibility area.
Okay. Just as well, some of the lose-win situations that you point out, they seem to be lose-win in the short term, but they possibly might be win-win in the long term. So is there a need maybe to like educate the market, for example, that they need to adopt and investors that they need to adopt more of a long-term perspective?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think the investors have figured it out. I cited the BlackRock policy initiative to require each of their fund managers to consider what they call ESG performance in making their investment decisions. There have also been a number of academic studies in this area, and they show that the better CSR performance, the better stock returns are. It's a small but positive correlation. So I think investors are figuring this out, that short-term performance isn't the be-all end-all, that long-term performance can be improved by good short-term CSR performance.
Okay. Yep. With regards to the Microsoft examples that you gave, one interesting insight was that you mentioned on a few occasions that there were penalties applied as opposed to rewards. So was there any rationale that Microsoft actually introduced penalties as opposed to just incentives? I mean, typically I teach management control systems and we focus very much on results controls, rewards, incentives. We don't tend to focus on actually putting in place penalties.
Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin. An incentive is an avoidance of a penalty. Mm-hmm. So Microsoft has this carbon tax. If you want to boost your bottom line, you will reduce your carbon tax. The carbon tax is a penalty, but reducing it is your incentive. This is an interesting area of research that I got into a little bit. In the US, we very, very rarely see penalties as part of an incentive contract. You go to China, you see them all the time. So if you don't do what the corporation wants, they come back and take part of your salary back. It's a powerful incentive. So you can phrase it either way. I'm not sure what's going on in Australia. You're probably more like the US than you are China. Mm-hmm. But penalties and incentives are just two sides of the same coin. They motivate people to do things.
Okay. And are you able to provide any examples of some of the reward incentives and how they structure those rewards at Microsoft, how managers are actually specifically incentivized?
Yeah, sure. In these areas where they can measure performance, like water usage, they create what we know as SMART goals. I'm not sure I can remember what all these things are, but they're specific, measurable, actionable, time dependent. I don't know what SMART stands for. I mean, SMART's a term that's been around a long time. But yeah, they set very specific goals. They measure performance. So the goal might be to reduce water usage by 3% next year. So the time frame is specific, the goal is specific, the incentive is monetary in Microsoft's case. It might be a team goal, so the team might get a 3% bonus each if the goal is met, and there's another 2% bonus if they're meeting goals in the energy area, and so on. So they're very specific monetary incentives tied to these goals.
Okay. And I suppose one that's your thoughts on the trade-offs, like if there's a trade-off between different stakeholders, say for example, a trade-off between the customers and the suppliers, how would a company deal with that?
Yeah, well, management is dealing with the arts of trade-offs. You probably want to minimize the damage to both because you don't want to lose either of them. But I'd have to look at all the specifics. I can't answer that question in the abstract. Okay.
Yep. And one that's a bit of a tangent. The International Accounting Standards Board, as you may be aware, is considering moving into this space. So your thoughts on the International Accounting Standards Board sort of coming in to sort of regulate the CSR area?
Yeah, I have a slide in my presentation I took out about all the organizations that are now in the area of prescribing reporting requirements for corporations. And it's a long list. It's probably 8 or 9 different bodies already telling corporations what they ought to report. And there's no consistency in what's required or suggested. And I think some of these organizations have more a unique comparative advantage in this area than the IASB, which is a group of accountants. So I wouldn't, I mean, the ISB is full of smart people. They could probably figure it out, but I wouldn't welcome the news that the ISB is now going to require disclosures in the CSR area of corporations. We got enough people working in this area already, and I think they're already light years ahead of the ISB.
I suppose that leads to possibly another question. Are accountants the best people to be dealing with this, or do we need to adopt a different perspective, maybe listening to people from outside accounting, maybe environmental scientists, for example?
Oh, there's no question that accountants' knowledge in this area is limited. Environmental scientists are one part of the people that should be required to be participating. When companies set goals, for instance, in the waste area or energy usage area, what they tend to do is go to the scientists and try to understand what is possible. So that sets an ideal goal, and then they'll set an achievable goal in the short run. And so they don't go to the accountants to say what should our goal should be for waste reduction. They go to the scientists, and so yeah, this goes well beyond accountant. We have another challenge too, and that is we want the numbers that are reported to be reliable. In the financial accounting area, we rely on auditors. Should our audit firms be the ones who are auditing the reports in the non-financial area? They would love to get into this area. It's a whole new source of revenue for them. But there are probably other organizations, I'm thinking of some of the technical consulting firms, probably could provide better help in this area than the financial accounting auditors. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of churning in this area, and accountants don't have all the answers. I say that as an accountant myself.
Yeah. A question that's come in specific to Microsoft about how it's claiming to work towards carbon neutrality. But a bit of a contradiction there, since it relies on the internet, and the internet is now consuming terawatts a day. So
yeah, I had a quote here from Satya Nadella. Let's see if I can find it. He says, we use more energy than some of the small US states, some also more than some small countries. When you are that large, you have to be part of the solution. So Microsoft is never going to be carbon neutral unless they buy a lot of these carbon credits that some companies are selling. Yeah, it's a huge challenge for them, and they're such a big player that they recognize their moral obligation to do good in this area.
Another one that's coming about Microsoft is you mentioned that I think it was the engineers, probably the majority are still ambivalent or tolerant. So why would that be? How come they haven't sort of embraced the culture, and how do you get the engineers to shift?
Yeah, so what do you get when you're trained in engineering? You become efficiency experts. You squeeze costs and inefficiencies out of your product, and you're designing products that appeal to the largest market. And now you got people coming at you with requests that are different from any that you've considered before. They're looking at market sub-niches. They're asking for some things that probably don't make economic sense, that may cost more to develop than they'll provide in returns to Microsoft. So it's countercultural, and so there's a natural resistance. People are resistant to change, and engineers may be even more resistant to change than others. So it's a slow process. You can't walk in to an organization and overnight have everybody become a CSR zealot.
Okay. And another question, do you see any challenges in terms of applying your insights to the financial services sector? So a specific one for financial services.
Well, you're going to get some of my biases now. I think a lot of people who are attracted to the financial services industry are money motivated, subscribe to the old greed is good philosophy, and they're used to measuring everything in financial terms, and so their resistance to change may be higher than in some other industries. That's about all I can say. I don't know. That would be an interesting academic study, actually, to get into some of the financial services industries and see if the feelings about CSR vary from those in other industries. And I'll bet you they do.
Okay, yeah.
Although BlackRock is in the financial services industry, and they're taking the lead in this area. So you can't paint the industry with one brush.
Okay. Okay. That sort of brings us to the end of the questions in the Q&A. Oh no, sorry. Another one's just popped in. So, how your views on Microsoft is approaching the modern slavery risk of conflict minerals sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
I'm not aware of the specific. Are they using suppliers that are using blood diamonds or something, producing blood diamonds or something in the Congo?
I suppose it's the issue of just how they're approaching their supply chain, how they're actually trying to ensure that their supply chain does adhere to their requirements.
Yeah, I spent a fair bit of time with the supply chain people at Microsoft, and they, if they knew that they were buying from companies that are using slave labor, I think they would immediately stop buying from that supplier, even if it cost them a lot of money. That's just one of their core beliefs. Their supply chain, I think, is as clean of that type of activity as it can be.
Okay, well, I think it's pretty good timing to come to the end of the question and answer session. So thank you for everyone for those questions. I'll hand over back to Christo now, who's going to wrap things up and tell you about the next upcoming session.
Thanks, Ralph. Thank you, Ken. You provided some really interesting insights from a research point of view, especially for me, at least, and also something that I can actually share with my students. The Microsoft example is really nice. I like that a lot. And it really goes to say how when a certain firm in its culture or leadership strongly believes in something, they can instill throughout the organization a will to actually do what is right, and everything else falls into place. So these are really good insights. I think it's fantastic to actually test some of these ideas, and I'll certainly take them on board. And I hope that the audience has also benefited a lot from your insights. Ralph, thanks a lot. You've done a wonderful job in actually coordinating the many questions that have come through, and it led to a really interesting discussion as well. So thank you both for that. It's been a really good session. So I'd like to just take this opportunity in closing to thank everyone for attending, especially the regular attendees who've been attending all the webinars. We've had a really good year. We've had some interesting talks, and so it's been good. Our next session is a webinar that will be held sometime in the next couple of months. I'll announce it. But I'd like you to, especially for those of you who are within Australia, to keep in mind that we are going to schedule a one-day symposium where we will have a panel discussion. And the theme is on the intersection between culture and governance. And I think that's a very important topic right now, as is CSR as well, very timely topic, culture and governance. And there's been a lot of issues there, especially in Australia. So I think it'll be a very interesting day of presentations and also a panel discussion by some experts as well. So with that, I'd also like to thank everyone for making this webinar a great success. Thanks especially to Shahab, who's done a wonderful job in coordinating and making this all happen. This is fantastic, Shahab. Thank you very much. All right, guys. So I would like to end by wishing you all a really nice, well-deserved, restful, and enjoyable holiday break. Hope 2021, it can only get better. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Okay, so thank you again and have a great day. Okay, bye.